want to let folks know that while testing isn't generally considered a cutting edge or hot topic, most people consider it more like a utility, like plumbing, something everybody knows that they should have. But I found in my experience that there's many development shops that don't do testing, and usually it's because of a combination of reasons. They don't know how to write them. They think it'll take a long time to write them, or it's either too hard or too tedious to write, or they think they already have a code base and it's too late to write tests. When I first started writing tests about 6 years ago, I found them to be a very useful tool to add to my toolbox. I've been working with well-established code bases most of my career now.
Welcome back to the show. And today we're going to assert control over your legacy ColdFusion applications with a TestBox Quick Start. And I'm here with Ed Bartram. And we're going to look at what is unit testing, what is TestBox, what does he think a legacy application is anyway. We might delve a little bit into test-driven development, look at how to install TestBox quickly, and we'll look at issues of code coverage and what tests to write and all kinds of other best practices and tips. So, and Ed is talking about this at Into the Box, which is in less than a month's time from our record date. And just in case you don't know, Ed, he's been developing in ColdFusion since the beginning of the I can't even say the word, since the year 2000, let's say it that way. When ColdFusion was back in version 4.5. And he's the co-manager of the Chicagoland CFUG and previously the manager of the Nebraska CFUG. So he's got like lots of accolades for CFUG work in the ColdFusion community. And he's also been to many ColdFusion conferences, so too many to name, I would say. And he is an owner, a proud owner of a 1973 Volkswagen Beetle. So probably runs on ColdFusion, I'm guessing. But so welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you, Michaela. It's an honor to be speaking with you.
So let's just start off, what exactly do you define as a unit test?
Well, a unit test basically tests a unit. So a unit is a small piece of code. It could be a single method or function, or even a group of methods or functions, depending on how you want to generate the tests. But unit tests will test that unit of code, and it will test all branches of logic to make sure that it works well and that it does what it's intended to do.
And the idea here is if all your methods and functions are working correctly, then you've got a better chance that your whole ColdFusion app is working okay.
That's correct. You end up with code that you can trust, so you're more easily able to make changes confidently on that code.
I think you're going to use the R word for refactoring in a moment if we're not careful.
Yeah, that's a great part of writing unit tests, especially when you're dealing with a legacy code base. Legacy, there's some misconception about what that actually means. So some folks think that legacy means that it's just simply old code. But as Michael Feathers describes legacy code in his seminal book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, it's simply code without tests. So old code with tests is not considered legacy code, and you can even have new code without tests that would be considered legacy by that definition.
That's a very intriguing definition, because I thought you were going to say it was full of spaghetti or, used old syntax or something. But you're saying if it's not got good set of unit tests that cover all the code, then it's legacy.
Right, and there certainly could be spaghetti code in there, and probably is. And that's part of the problem as well. When you get that spaghetti code, people become afraid to actually make changes to it.
Yeah. So ability to make changes to your code is one of the benefits. What are the other benefits of going through all this unit tests and TestBox?
Well, like I said, it makes sure that your application runs without error and does what it's intended to do. So you can use these tests anytime to ensure that it runs correctly. It's particularly useful when you make changes to your application to find out if something breaks anywhere within your code base that you have tests written for. And then it's also useful when you're deploying to different environments, particularly your production environment. So if you run these tests as part of a build process, and if any test fails, you can have your build process actually stop before deploying that broken code to production.
That sounds a great thing, and I think we'll talk more about that later in continuous integration. But first, we just defined unit tests, but aren't there other kinds of tests like integration tests or maybe other kinds?
Sure. Unit tests are typically testing the logic within a particular method or group of methods, and not anything else that those methods call. Um, and that includes external dependencies, such as database. Um, so what we do is we write integration tests, which are structured much like unit tests, to test those external dependencies to make sure that the code that you have that's making those calls out actually work correctly without error. And then you can even, uh, in the case of database calls, insert records into it in order to do your unit test against, say, a read function to make sure that it's coming back this correctly. So it's doing what you intended it to do.
And when you're writing these unit tests, are you testing the logic or dependencies, or what exactly are you testing there, Ed?
Well, the unit tests are testing the logic. So anytime you have like an if branch or any other place where a code makes a decision, you want to make sure that it all gets tested, um, both sides of the branch. Um, so I'm losing track of where I was going on that one. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, are you testing logic or external dependencies? So unit tests are just testing the logic is correct and doesn't blow up when you call the functional method with different parameters.
That's correct, yeah. And the integration test is for testing the external dependencies.
And when you say external dependencies, what would be some examples of that?
Well, the external dependencies would be like database calls, calls out to your file system, AJAX calls to other systems. So anything
What
that you don't
about,
have full control over.
and does that include human input into the app, or?
Well, that would be more, I think, with maybe functional tests, like working with Selenium or something like that. So what I'm talking about with the unit test is after the data comes in. So you could emulate that data coming into your code like a user would key it in, but we're not actually testing what the user does itself.
Okay, so this doesn't involve any
Sorry.
humans. It can be totally automated using something like TestBox.
Yeah, it should be totally automated.
And just to look at that, because a lot of people are used to manually testing their code. What are the advantages of writing unit tests? I mean, effectively, you're writing a second set of code on top of your app that's going to test all the different units. So that could be a lot of work. Why would you want to have automated testing?
Well, some of the things that make a good unit test is that it should be repeatable. So you want to be able to run your unit test again and again and get the same set of results. Um, it should also be easy to implement. So if you're having a hard time, it's really some other kind of test, possibly an integration test. Um, Unit tests should be relevant tomorrow so that the tests that you write today, they should be able to run and function and act the same way they do again tomorrow or the next day or a year from now. Um, anyone should also be able to run these tests with a push of a button. So that's where it comes into the automation part. So with that push of a button, you should be able to run one of your unit tests, a test suite, or all of your unit tests. You should also be able to hook it up to a continuous integration system such as Jenkins. And so that when you make a commit to, say, your repository, that would then trigger something to Jenkins, which would fire off the build. And part of that build process would be to run your unit and integration tests before it actually then goes to the next step, which would be to deploy to whatever environment you're working with. Unit tests should also be consistent in their results. So if they're not consistent, your unit tests are going to fail. And sometimes people do write some brittle unit tests that are data dependent. And when you promote from one environment to another, that data may not be the same. That's where you catch those brittle tests sometimes because then they start failing. So you want to make sure that you're not dependent on any data that's in the database, for example, with integration tests. You should have full control of the unit under test. So every logical branch of that code should be tested. And they should also be fully isolated. So the tests should run independent of each other. One of the things that TestBox does is it runs them in random order. So your first test isn't always the first one that runs. That way, it eliminates any possibility of your tests being dependent on one. So you can't just set up a scenario in one test and then have a second test depend on that scenario, because you never know when they're going to actually run. So that forces you into doing it correctly. So a unit test shouldn't be dependent on another one, nor should it affect other tests that are running. And then finally, when a test fails, it should be easy to detect what was expected and determine how to pinpoint the problem.
Well, that sounds a comprehensive list of good practices for testing. Does TestBox fill all those requirements?
Yes, it sure does.
Now, you mentioned that you should be able to run the tests independent of what other code is run. So does that mean your tests have to do some pre-set up and put dummy data in the database, for example, so that the method gets whatever it's expecting?
Yeah, depending on what your test needs to do. At a minimum, you want to be setting up a variable pointing to your ColdFusion object. That's a good point that I hadn't mentioned before, is that your unit testing and your integration testing are testing methods and functions within a CFC. So they're not testing any of your code within your CFM. So one of the things in order to get to testing is you need to move your logic into CFCs so that you can test them from those unit tests and integration tests. As far as setting up database stuff, that's usually meant for integration tests. So like I said, if you're testing a method that does, say, a database read, don't count on that data actually being in that database, depending on the environment you're working in. So you're going to want to have code in your unit test wrapped in CF try, catch, and CF transaction, so that you can go ahead and insert a record into that database, then call that unit under test.
Okay, so you write some setup or code to create those records in the test box, and then you write teardown code after the test is done to clean it up. Is that how it works? Or?
Yeah, that's correct, because you don't want to be basically leaving test data out in your databases depending on what environment it is, because particularly if you're running it on your production environment, you don't want test data floating around out there.
And does TestBox make sure that only one test runs at a time? Or because I could imagine if you had multiple tests and they're all inserting things in the database or updating it or whatever, they could step on each other's toes. So.
It usually does run synchronously, but there is a way to run them asynchronously, and there's a few gotchas on there that you need to be aware of so that you don't accidentally have your tests stepping over each other like that.
Okay, so TestBox is basically a place where you can script out tests, and it has a special testing scripting language. Is that how it works, or what?
Sure. TestBox is the framework for writing tests. So there's some really smart people out there who've gone ahead and made this easy for us. Let me get to my note. So within the framework, you basically have 4 methods that are at your disposal. There's basically a setup and teardown that runs before all the tests, before the test suite runs and after, and then there's before tests and after tests that run before and after each individual test. So if you've got code that you want to share between the tests, you can put it in there, or you can do all your setup and tear down within the unit test itself. The unit test is just basically a method or a function, depending on how you want to call them. They typically start with the word test. What I do as a convention is that I will name the unit test after the method that it's testing. So if it's testing a method called read data, it would be called test read data. I also do something else that's a little uncommon, is I will add in some more English after it. So I'll put in an underscore and then basically when, so it's what you're testing, and then another underscore and what the expected result is. So it might be something like test read data when ID not passed returns empty result set, or something like that would be the actual test name. So that when you run those tests, you actually see that full test name on the screen or in the report, so you know exactly what happened.
Okay, so when you're running TestBox, you've got hundreds of tests, and if they fail, they pop up in a report showing you what's failed.
Right.
Is that
right?
And
yeah, that's
presumably
correct. So
that
it'll show all your past tests in green. It'll show anything that errors out in red, and it'll show any failures in kind of a yellowish orange color. Failures are at the end of your unit test. You write basically an assert. The assert basically declares what is the expected response from the test that you do. So if the assert fails, the test fails, and you'll see that instantly on the report. It'll be in yellow.
Okay, so part of the scripting language you have in TestBox, you can say certain assertions for exit conditions from the method, or what should have been changed in the database, or what exit code it should have, or anything like that.
Correct, yeah, and there's a whole library of these assertion codes, or assertion statements. Actually, they're functions. So you can test if something's equal, you can test if something is a type of, you can, basically anything you can think of, TestBox handles that assertion.
And then do you have to watch the tests, or can you programmatically tell whether all the tests passed or not?
You don't have to watch them all. Typically, if you run the tests manually, you're looking at it. But you can also set up, like I said, continuous integration with Jenkins or even Ant for doing your build. So it'll run everything, and you can have it watch to see if anything fails, and then it can report back that failure. It can send a message through chat, whether you're using Slack or HipChat. It could send emails to you. If you've got like a Raspberry Pi setup or something, you could have it ring a bell or something. Pretty much whatever your imagination can think of, you can pretty much set up to do through automation.
That sounds quite entertaining, having a Raspberry Pi ring a bell every time a test fails. It might make quite a noisy environment in certain teams.
Sure, but one of the things is that if you have tests that fail and that's part of your build, you want to get those resolved quickly. So you really shouldn't proceed any further. You should go back, fix your tests before you do anything else so that you get those tests running correctly. You don't want to be the guy who breaks the build.
Right. Because you might have to wear that silly hat for the rest of the day because you were the guy or girl who broke the build.
Yeah, I've been on a team that the hat that you had to wear was a tiara.
They are the prince or princess of the build breaking.
Yep.
Now, if you're using, everyone knew. So if, and maybe you even have a board on the wall, number of days without having an accident making a build, you know, like construction sites do, right?
Oh, sure, yeah, definitely. I'm thinking of the Simpsons intro now.
Now, if you're using a continuous integration tool like Jenkins, presumably it can tell the tests failed, and it could not deploy the code to production if the tests failed, or not deploy it to staging or whatever part of the build you're automating.
Exactly, yeah, that would be ideal. You don't want to deploy code that isn't working, whether it's an error or a failed assertion. You want to make sure that every one of those tests is working and functioning as intended. If it doesn't, you really do not want to deploy to production.
So this really makes it much more likely the code is thoroughly working, at least at the unit level. And not only was it working on your development server, because you could run these tests on your own development server, I assume, and then they can get run again when it gets deployed to staging. Is that, and again when you deploy to production?
Right, that's correct, and that's how you don't break the build, is you make sure they run on your local environment first before you ever try pushing it out to any kind of shared environment.
Okay, so, and TestBox is expensive or free or what?
TestBox is free, and you don't need to be using the ColdBox ecosystem to use it either. TestBox will run on any and every framework in ColdFusion, including no frameworks. So everybody can and should use it. It is currently the recommended testing framework. MX Unit used to be, but that has not been active in quite a while now. But the good news for those developers who are still using it is that TestBox is fully compatible with MX Unit. So if you just drop TestBox into your code, it can and will run all your tests without having to make any changes.
Well, that is great. So if you have a test suite you previously wrote in MX Unit, you can just plug it straight in and it'll pick up that legacy test syntax. Or you can choose to write new tests using the new syntax in TestBox.
Correct.
Now, although TestBox is free, if you want support, are there like paid support packages or?
I'd have to look into that. I'd imagine Origis Solutions, who make TestBox, would be happy to sell you consulting services. There's also places on the internet that you can get support as well. I think particularly the CFML Slack workspace is a great one. There's a testing channel there that you can ask questions to, and lots of friendly people will answer them.
That is a great resource there, both the testing channel and all the other channels in the CFML Slack. And if anyone listening is not on that, I'd recommend checking it out. Free to join. So, now, how does TestBox relate to Mockbox? Are they one and the same these days, or?
I believe Mockbox is part of the TestBox, so that you can use it to mock objects and mock methods. The reason why you want to do mocking, there's also stubs and spies and other things, but I don't really get into that in my presentation. But mocking, I think, is a really important concept to understand, and makes you able to write these unit tests. Basically, if you have a method that calls other methods, when you write the unit test, you only want to test the code that's within that one method that you're writing that unit test for. You don't want to run the other methods. So you would write a mock, which would tell the TestBox framework that instead of calling off this other method, just return this hard-coded value or whatever you want it to return instead, so that when you run your unit test against that one method, when it calls the other methods, it just gets the supplied values that you've given it instead of actually making those other calls out to the other methods. So that allows you then to test just the logic within the single unit method that you're testing. And like I said, there's other ways of doing that too, with spies and stubs and all that too, but I really only go over mocks, which I think is the main important one to get. And then once you get that, you can then branch out with your knowledge and figure out what some of the other tools do.
The other use of mocking is if you're in a team and maybe some of the code hasn't been written yet, right? And you need to test your bit and it depends on someone else's code that doesn't exist. And then you'd mock that out so you could run your tests.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, black box it so that, yeah, there's plenty of times with the current team that I'm working with that we don't quite have all the database stuff set up yet. So while we're waiting for that, we just mock it up and run from there. And then when it really comes available, then we can call that in our integration tests.
Now, how does this relate to test-driven development? Is this what you'd use to do that? And maybe we should just tell listeners what test-driven development is.
Well, test-driven development is the process of writing your tests first, and then you write your code that makes the test pass after that. And that's usually done in very small increments. So you write a little bit of a test that fails, then you write the code in your code base to make that test pass, then you modify that test a little bit so that it fails again, and then you write a little bit more code in the system to make it pass. They call it red-green testing. What I'm really covering in the presentation is more of just using unit testing and integration testing for getting control out of your legacy application. So once you've written all your tests, then you'd want to move into something along the lines of test-driven development. But if you've already got a code base and there's no tests, you can't really do that TDD just because the code is there and there's no tests. So you need to pick apart your code. You need to refactor it into smaller chunks that's easily testable, and then build up that suite of tests.
But the end goal of writing tests for legacy code is eventually you've got tests covering all the code, and now when you write new features, you could do test-driven development if you wanted to.
Certainly, yeah. If you're writing any new code, any greenfield code, you definitely want to be using more of a TDD approach, writing those tests first, and then writing the code to make them pass afterwards.
Now, I know a lot of people are used to just churning out code and then kind of doing testing as an afterthought. So the concept that you write the test first and then you code is quite radical. What's the benefit of taking that approach?
It's really difficult to get yourself into that mode of writing those tests first, and and then writing the code after. One of the benefits that I see is that you're actually writing tests that are more meaningful to the code. So sometimes when you write the tests after you've written the code, you're just writing um, tests that do what you believe it's supposed to do. When you write the tests beforehand, those tests basically become your project requirements, um, and that eventually moves you into something like BDD, behavioral driven development, where you've got user acceptance criteria that you're testing against.
Now, if you want to install TestBox into your existing legacy environment, how do you do that quickly?
There's a couple ways you can do it. If you've got command box set up, you can pretty much run a box command to install it. But if you don't have that available, you can just download TestBox, and there's basically one folder with a bunch of more folders under that, and you drop that in the root of your folder, and you've got TestBox. If you don't want to drop it into the root of your code base, you can put it anywhere else and then just create a mapping to it.
Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. And I'd recommend the command box because it's not like command box itself is hard to install, and it also is free. So, and it also gives you some other testing benefits if you've got to deploy against multiple versions of ColdFusion. So definite advantages in using command box, I would say. Now,
Sure, and then like TestBox, command box doesn't require that you use ColdBox either. You can use any framework that you want.
yeah, it's almost like that box at the end is kind of accidental. You know, it's not like they're really related, other than it's the same group of people who've created these clever tools. So now, suppose you have installed TestBox. What is that? You know, and you've got legacy code, and there aren't any tests. How exactly do you start? Because it's like could be a bit overwhelming. You might have tens or hundreds of thousands of lines of code, none of which have tests. Where would you start if you were dealing with that?
Pretty much, I would start with whatever bugs that you're currently working on, or whatever code changes you're working on. I like to tell the other developers on my team that if you're touching the code and there's no test for it, write a test for it first, make sure it passes, and then go ahead and modify the code. So basically, you write the tests as you go along, continuing to work. You don't just stop all work and write tests for everything. You do it as you go along. One of the ways I like to do it is to first pull out the queries. So a lot of times with old code, you see everything all just kind of in line. So I'll start with the queries. I'll pull those out into their own methods and then write an integration test for that. Then once all the queries are pulled out, then you're left with the logic. The logic then you can start reducing into more sensible methods and then write unit tests against those methods to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
And when you're doing this, presumably if you see the same query in 7 different places, it all goes in one method, not in 7 different methods.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it allows you to reduce all those calls into a single one for sure. Just testing in general leads you down the path towards better OOP practices.
Now, are you assuming that people are writing an MVC kind of app when they do this, that it's got model, view, and controller parts to it, or?
Well, that's certainly helpful, but I don't think it's necessary. Um, a lot of times with legacy apps, they're just all written inline in CFMs. Um, in that case, you need to start moving, like I said, the queries and the logic out of those CFMs. Treat your CFM like your view, whether you've got a framework or not. Your CFMs should be your views. Your model is basically all your CFCs. So move your code into CFCs if you don't already have it there.
So you can either shift to MVC, which once you've got all the queries in separate methods and you've got all the business logic in separate methods, it actually would be a pretty easy third step. Or you could just say it's fine how it is.
Yeah, I'd strongly recommend to implement some sort of framework, and whether it's ColdBox or Framework One or anything else, or if you've got some sort of homegrown framework that you're using at your company, and you feel comfortable with that and it does what you need to do, continue using it. But you want to start separating out your logic from your views.
Now, I think that's a good idea, but why do you think it's good to separate out the views from the logic and database stuff?
Well, theoretically, if you completely isolate your views, it makes it easier for your application then to be modified for other things. So if you wanted to write like a mobile app for it, um, or if you're doing, say, a lot of reporting, um, being able to just generate your reports as PDFs instead of relying on all your logic being inside of the CFM for displaying it in HTML.
And also
So it just
from a
makes it more portable.
right, that's a great point. And also from a testing point of view, I assume it makes the complexity of the code less and reduces the number of bugs you can have from dependencies between view pieces of code and logic and database, because now they're separated and you know if a method fails exactly what it's doing.
Right. And then your CFMs, your views can then be tested by QA folk using something like Selenium. So you can cover all your bases that way.
Right, and Selenium is a scripting testing thing that will pretend to type keystrokes or click the mouse and let you simulate having a human use the app, but it's all scripted.
Right. Right.
So before we turn to any other questions about ColdFusion, Ed, is there anything else you want to share about TestBox and taking control of your legacy apps?
Well, I want to let folks know that while testing isn't generally considered a cutting edge or hot topic, most people consider it more like a utility, like plumbing, something everybody knows that they should have. But I found in my experience that there's many development shops that don't do testing, and usually it's because of a combination of reasons. They don't know how to write them. They think it'll take a long time to write them, or it's either too hard or too tedious to write, or they think they already have a code base and it's too late to write tests. When I first started writing tests about 6 years ago, I found them to be a very useful tool to add to my toolbox. I've been working with well-established code bases most of my career now, while working with ColdFusion, and much of it has traditionally been legacy. Sometimes that code is so knotted up and complex that everyone is afraid to touch it for fear of breaking the system. Like any large knot, you can't attack the problem all at once. You need to tease out the smaller knots, which eventually leads to unraveling the larger knot. So by isolating these pieces of the legacy code into their own methods and writing tests for them, I'm able to break up that complex code that everybody fears into something that's easily understood and trustworthy. So pretty much any developer will tell you that they enjoy doing puzzles. Testing is one of my favorite tools for solving puzzles within existing code bases.
And I think also just by writing the tests, it makes you think about the code and realize some issues in there, even without the test running and failing. You may realize, oh, wait a minute, I forgot to deal with this condition or that condition.
Yeah, that's definitely correct as well. It allows you to double check your work.
Great. Well, I'm excited that you're talking about this Into the Box. So let's just turn to some questions about ColdFusion. Why are you proud to use ColdFusion?
Well, it's been a language that I've used 100% of the time for the last 18 years of my professional life. So I love working in ColdFusion because it's both comfortable to work in, yet it also stretches me as I continually find new things that I can do with it in every release. There's been a lot of effort over the years to evolve ColdFusion and to keep pace with other languages and modern programming concepts.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I really feel in the last few years, between all the box products and other initiatives to make ColdFusion more modern and a live language, that really it is alive. And that's one of the reasons I started this CF Alive podcast, just to showcase the cool stuff that you're doing and other people are doing to use ColdFusion in a really modern way. And to be honest, a lot of this stuff doesn't actually exist in other languages. You know, some of this cutting edge stuff we're talking about on the show, you cannot do in other languages. So I just want people to forget this idea that ColdFusion is dying. It is very alive. It can be used as a modern development language, and lets you write amazing applications fast. So that brings me to my penultimate question, which is, what would it take to make ColdFusion more alive this year?
So I've actually given this a lot of thought, and over the years, there have been many developers that we've all come to know as leading voices in ColdFusion, who've contributed to the community via podcasts, blogs, open source projects, presentations, even conferences. Because some of them have moved on to other things doesn't, to me, mean that ColdFusion is dying. Instead, it means that ColdFusion is evolving as opportunities arise for other developers to step in and participate. Some of these developers are new to the community, but some are longtime ColdFusion developers, such as myself, that have just taken a little longer to find their voice. But because speaking may not be for everyone, there's other ways I think developers can contribute and help make ColdFusion more alive. Simply attending user groups, and not just ColdFusion specific groups, but non-CF groups as well. So I would tell people, don't be shy or embarrassed to let others know that you're proud to use ColdFusion. Some developers may give you a little bit of grief, but if you can get past that, they will start to be curious. And when you start showing them what ColdFusion can do, you can help these other developers understand what ColdFusion is, a modern language, just as capable and alive as whatever language they're using. I've got another way that my employer has helped make CF more alive is by hiring and training junior developers. So our development team needed rapid growth, and we had difficulty finding senior level CF developers locally who were interested in leaving their current positions. Because we weren't able to hire remote developers either, we decided to create a training program. Over the last 2 years, we've brought on board 7 new junior developers who were quickly trained, and every one of them has been highly successful within our team. In fact, these junior developers have helped rejuvenate many of our senior level developers' passions and brought in new ideas. I think the development team that we have there has experienced a renaissance that I think can easily be duplicated at other companies.
I think that's an excellent idea, and you and your company deserve a CF Alive Oscar for taking initiative there and not just complaining that you can't hire, but doing something positive about it that grows the community and also helps your existing ColdFusion developers feel better. So let's turn to what you're looking forward to at Into the Box this year.
Well, I'm looking forward to speaking at the conference or at any conference. To be honest, I've given presentations to user groups and several development teams, but this is going to be my first speaking engagement at a conference, so I'm really excited about that. But I'm also looking forward to learning about a variety of topics, particularly BDD, which is very closely related to my topic, and then also meeting new people and catching up with some old friends.
I've got to say that Into the Box was an amazing conference last year. Lots of cool talks, interesting people. You got lots of time to chat with speakers and attendees in between sessions. And of course, there's also the Happy Box special event, which I believe probably involves mariachi band of some kind. So it's a lot of fun. And I think I saw an announcement today that there's only 15 seats left in the conference. It's almost totally sold out. So congrats to the organizers, Ortis, on that. And looks like an exciting event. So if people want to find you online, Ed, what are the best places to do that?
Well, the key to finding me online is my name. My website is edbartram.com. I'm on Twitter at edbartram. And in the CFML workspace on Slack, I'm Ed Bartram.
And just for people listening, Bartram is spelled with 2 A's, even though it's pronounced as though it had a U in it. So, and we'll put those links in the show notes on the TerraTech site
Correct.
For this podcast episode. So, well, thanks so much for coming on the show, Ed.
Well, thank you, Michaela. It's been a real pleasure, and I want to thank you for all you've done for the ColdFusion community. There's a lot of quiet developers out there who you may not hear from, but your efforts throughout the years are very much appreciated.
Well, thanks for saying that. And if anyone listening wants to come on the show because they want to go from quiet developer to sharing their cool ColdFusion stories, please send me an email or message me somehow. Always happy to get new guests on the show. So, and I'm delighted you came on the show. This is your premiere time on the show. I'm sure it won't be the last time.